Welcome to session 4. You must be very keen to be here so late in the afternoon. Thank you very much. The biggest problem I find with trying to explain to people what the internet is and can do is the models that we already have in our head. And I think that by and large, many of the models we already have in our head are obsolete and in some cases quite wrong. Let's just take the recent case of Bell Mobility versus Denton class, the thing which is now before the CRTC. The CRTC, in its usual quiet way, sort of accomplished a bit of a revolution by admitting that there was broadcasting riding upon a transport layer. Now, the idea that there are layers and that this engineering conception has filtered into their understanding of how things work and how things should or should not be regulated was itself a bit of a revolution. And they could have gone on for many, many, many pages justifying how they had suddenly discovered, after many years of the internet, that the internet is composed of various kinds of notional engineering layers, where certain functions are carried on at a layer that are by certain economic actors, and that other economic actors will play at lower or different layers. So Bell is now taking the CRTC to court over this, saying, no, no, no. If it's a broadcasting application on top, it's broadcasting all the way down. So from that point of view, Bell is arguing that the internet doesn't really exist, or if it exists, ought properly to be ignored by the courts. And this brings me, first of all, I would say that the CRTC might have done a better job of explaining the revolution, conceptual revolution it finally came to when it decided that, yes, there is a broadcasting layer and it's an app, and an app is not all the way down. Might have done a better job of explaining that. But you see, the second thing that happens then is that the pre-existing conception of what we're dealing with is not given in statute. There's no statute called the Internet Statute. There's no Internet law. There's a Broadcasting Act and a Telecom Act. And so through these two quite radically different forms of spectacles, we look at the phenomena. And when you look at things through the spectacles of the Broadcasting Act, you can't see the internet. And when you can't see the internet, you go and make decisions that are, wholly appropriate to a 1950s distribution technology, which has nothing to do with a 2012, 2015 distribution technology. So I think that this may be my obsession, but I am obsessed with the notion that the laws that we have, in a large part, constitute mental shackles for understanding, and that many people in government and at the CRTC are paid reasonably large salaries not to understand the internet. They're paid to administer the Broadcasting Act, and they're paid to administer the Telecom Act, but they're not paid to administer the Internet Act. So I think that for my point, one of the things that disturbs me in all of this is that I do not understand how people can watch Netflix, see what that system engenders, and then go back to the CRTC and have the cognitive dissonance of taking that experience and trying to shape it into, broadcasting, video on demand, specialized something service. It's like it's wrapping something that isn't broadcasting and then punching it into the wrong hole. So I think that until we get to some kind of recognition that the internet exists and that it runs on different principles than the Broadcasting Act, we in Canada will face a perpetual problem of the regulator always coming up and saying, this is broadcasting, but we're not going to regulate it. Well, it isn't broadcasting, and you shouldn't be regulating it. But they're not going to get there until there's legislative change, or some kind of admission that what they've been doing for 25 years is not really an adequate understanding of what we face. That may be just my obsession with what the problem is, but I think it permeates. The other thing I think is the idea, and we've discussed it earlier, The other major concern I have is that everybody loves the internet except everyone whose ox is gored by it. So the broadcasting industry is one. The online gambling industry, well, law of Quebec, the attempt of the Quebec government, which is still being mulled over inside the Quebec government, to cause internet service providers to engage in highly expensive and quite useless re-engineering to block access by Quebec residents to gambling sites that are not law of Quebec. It's an ancient Quebec tradition of driving commerce to the approved site. And doing this on the internet is just an ancient political reflex to engender monopolies and control monopolies in your own benefit. And nothing has changed. It's just the means whereby it's to be accomplished. So net neutrality is an extremely important thing. I think we've got that one right. Net neutrality is the attempt to create incentives for carriers to create abundance rather than scarcity. And when you create scarcity, then you can create special fast lanes to solve the problem of scarcity, which only creates more incentive to maintain the scarcity of bandwidth, whereby you maintain your monopoly rents. So I think we've got that one largely right. And I think the United States, in its hugely cumbersome way, has finally got that one right. And I think we're working on the right direction at any rate. Yes, there's not enough broadband access. Yes, it could be more. Yes, they have to be incentivized, but not at the price of losing, not at the expense of creating incentives to create scarcity, which you can then monetize by giving special passes for your people who are paid higher rates. So then I made my intervention recently that if you think what CSE and NSA do is intrusive, I think people really need to start contemplating what ubiquitous embedded sensors will mean, how these sensors will be placed in the environment, may not be subject to human attention particularly, may be tied to certain manufacturers but not under a common protocol, might be basically we might be subject to universal private sector or public sector surveillance of all kinds of our activities, and that the Ashley Madison scandal will be replicated in 1,000 different circumstances. My wife, for instance, opened up her device and found that, did Google Maps and found that yesterday's travel patterns were indicated on a map. And then she went back the day before and her other travel patterns were on a map. This is already embedded in our devices. And if that information is available to her, it's quite likely it's available to someone else. So we are heading for some very serious issues of universal embedded sensory networks using RFIDs and all kinds of trillions of IP addresses to make all this stuff work. I am myself concerned that the biggest public policy concern over the next 10 years will be the extent to which we will be under what I would call almost unconscious surveillance by machine sensors. And not all of it will necessarily be good or desirable. So that's my set of concerns. Others will have others and maybe better ones. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today and participate in these great conversations. I really appreciate the passion that you all have for these issues, so it's really good to be in the room with you today. I'm the Executive Director of Canada's Digital Policy Forum, and we're exactly that. We're a forum for discussion on digital policy issues. To date, we've held several roundtables on issues like cybersecurity, privacy, we've covered the sharing economy, and we're looking at digital skills and all the kind of issues that are important to a successful digital economy. So I can share with you some of the insights that we've gained through those conversations. And I'll note that when we have our roundtable discussions, we try to have a good representation from civil society, government, and the private sector. I really appreciated the comments about civil society today. I couldn't agree more about the need for us to grow this important sector and the contribution that it can make to public policy. I'm always energized when I go down to Washington, and I can go to pretty much, I don't need to have a schedule when I go down to Washington, because there's so many free events and conversations about the things that are of relevance and of interest to me. We don't have that kind of dialogue and activity in Ottawa. I think that it's growing, and we're seeing more and more, but not to the extent that I'd love to see, and the kind of influencing and sharing of information that can have a real positive impact on Canadian public policy, in particular digital policy. Some of the, so I'll share with you some of the insights we've had as it pertains to the interests of the end user. Some of the dialogue we've had at our forums has actually been around asking ourselves that particular question in terms of what are the interests of end users, and I think we need to step back a little bit to determine overall what indeed are the interests of end users, and some may reflect on what right do we actually have to determine that. Do we leave it up to the choice of individuals in free markets, or as civil society and government, do we intervene with laws and regulations, or do we land somewhere in between? I think the main message that I have is that these are all very legitimate and important issues for us to engage in, but not to lose sight that these are challenges to reach the opportunity and benefits that these new technologies provide. So I do think we can certainly justify a role for government, but we have to be careful that policy doesn't prevent us from realizing the opportunities that we have. So there are 4 areas that I'll just touch briefly on that we've discussed. One's data protection and privacy, access, cybersecurity, and then the economic benefits, because I think that it's the economic benefits directly impact the end user with economic prosperity and social value. On the subject of data protection, Solveig Singleton of the Institute for Policy Innovation, we had the pleasure of having to one of our discussions. She pointed out, and I think it's very true when I listened to some of you today, about how emotional the data protection debate is. And that can sometimes make it difficult to see the forest through the trees. She pointed out an interesting principle that one should be able to learn about people as long as you don't hurt them and cause a concrete harm. If we think about that for a minute, though, we have to determine what a concrete harm is, and that's not necessarily knowable. The advocacy model we have in Canada was selected because of the need for flexibility. And in the conversations that I have, and it's by no means scientific, but there does seem to be broad corporate and public support for the work and the role of the Privacy Commissioner and PETA thus far. But the principles aren't applied in the same way in each instance, because privacy laws do not exist in absolute, and the system seems to be appropriately flexible. Although as an observer, I propose that perhaps the conversation seems to be more on potential harms, but not the benefits. And are we taking the benefits for granted? The Office of the Privacy Commissioner conducted consultations earlier in the year that looked at what work they should be focused on going forward. And the feedback, and I certainly, I need to rely heavily on friends and community to really understand what's happening in the minds of Canadians, because I am very much in the Ottawa bubble. But The consultation background documents did seem to position big data as more of a problem than an opportunity. And I do think we need a system and approach that enables us to take advantage of the benefits and have balanced dialogue on some of these issues. People should have the right to regulate information about themselves. When it comes to consent, there is support for consistency. We all know that nobody reads the contract, and I agree without hesitation. But notices of consent assume that you know where your information is going. And Tim's mentioned the Internet of Things, or the Internet of way too many things. And we don't necessarily know where information is going to go at that point, so is consent really a feasible policy model? Another place that we've heard a lot about is youth participation, and that does present serious problems, especially with teenagers. There's no easy answers. Research shows that young people are tremendously enthusiastic adopters, but they lack the technical skills to be future employees and lack the critical thinking and ethical skills to be useful citizens. Education that kids are getting isn't coming from schools, it's not coming from their parents, it's coming, ironically enough, online. So there's a gap when it comes to effective and responsible use. Young people who care about privacy, they are less concerned with keeping things to themselves than trying to keep control over their audience. But a big barrier is indeed the opacity of privacy policies, because parents don't feel capable of teaching their kids about privacy. And we are dealing with an age that communicates differently now than 5 years ago, and it seems like we're trying to apply an old regulatory system. A good example is the sharing economy and the many benefits that it brings, but it's often those businesses are hampered by old regulatory models designed for a different time. So the question is, when is it time to innovate? Do we modify or start from scratch? There's tremendous social change happening, so it's hard to establish rules. It's hard to track various expectations. We're often trying to find solutions to a problem, but we don't necessarily know what the problem is. A little bit on access. I don't know if you saw earlier this week, but there was a White House report. It was Obama's Broadband Opportunity Council. They said that an internet service has steadily shifted from an optional amenity to a core utility. It is now taking its place alongside water, sewer, and electricity. That's a really big deal, to quote Donald Trump. And there was a blog associated with that mentioned that 51 million Americans still cannot purchase broadband with download speeds of 25 megabits per second. Now that's also interesting. The US goal, the definition in the US of broadband is 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up. The US goal is 10 down, 1 up. But according to Industry Canada, broadband service refers to download speeds of 1.5 megabits per second or greater. And through the Connecting Canadians program, the government's objective is to increase internet speeds to only 5 megabits per second for rural areas and 3 to 5 in areas covered by the northern component of the program. Canadians do use the internet, but not always at cutting edge speed. According to the International Telecommunications Union, Canada ranks 26 out of 86 countries for a number of fixed broadband subscriptions per 100 inhabitants. So that strategy for 5 megabits per second came at a digital 150, and I'll leave it up, for discussion in terms of whether that's we're shooting for the stars or not. On cybersecurity, I'll just point out we did have Melissa Hathaway up. She's a former Obama and Bush advisor on cybersecurity. She said that, I think it's relevant for today, that we are in a competition, and if you don't think we are, we've already lost. We have been occupied by the economic benefits of the internet and not necessarily always consider the security implications that this creates. The economic growth, national security, and individual liberties depend on guaranteeing that the internet is secure, open, and reliable. So a lot of what we've talked about at our forums is the role of awareness and education, really important to ensure an online society that has the critical skills to be online responsibly from both a privacy and security perspective. There's a lot at stake and we're very vulnerable. Finally, on the economic impact on the end user, I'd suggest we must take that into account, take into account the social and economic benefits. Our performance globally is usually in the mediocre zone. When it comes to the digital economy in 2013, the Fletcher Tufts University Digital Evolution Index put Singapore, Sweden, and Hong Kong as the biggest standout countries. Canada ranked 8th. The World Economic Forum's 2015 Global Information Technology Report, it assesses the factors, policies, and institutions that enable a country to fully leverage ICT for increased competitiveness. Canada ranks 11th. And back to the Internet of Things, McKinsey said in June that the annual economic value of the Internet of way too many things is going to be between 3.9 and 11.1 trillion by 2025. If we say that Canada's 2.5% of the global economy, I probably need an economist to help, but our portion could be about $97 billion. So are we setting Canada up to take the largest piece of the pie? And I'm going to stop there because I think I'm out of time.
Dealing with legislative policy on the one hand and regulatory issues on the other. So first, starting with legal and regulatory, there is now, or legal and policy, there is a proceeding before the CRTC right now to define what basic service objectives there should be for voice, internet, and so on. What type of minimum standards there should be, what type of funding might be required to extend those throughout Canada, and so on. A wonderful debate, a wonderful discussion, and glad the CRTC is doing it. The problem is that in terms of actually implementing anything, legislatively, the powers that the CRTC has to do it are quite narrow. It has very wide information gathering powers, but in terms of actually accomplishing something, it is operating within a closed system of telecommunications service providers. It can take from one to create subsidies for users, but it can't take advantage of the greater society wealth that we have to put the resources when they're needed. And that, for me, creates a bit of a dilemma, because while we acknowledge that these are very important priorities and they should be addressed and accommodated, we have to be very careful not to lay it all at the CRTC's feet. If we do that, what we're going to end up, in order to solve the problem in a realistic way, could well be subsidies that create a huge financial burden for existing telecommunication providers, to the extent even of putting perhaps some of them out of business. But even if not, distorting other markets and thereby raising prices for retail services for end users in the process. So I think it's incumbent upon us as a society to give our government the message that it is governmental responsibility to create a stable, long-term funding method to provide these services and make sure that all Canadians can take advantage of a basic service definition, whatever that might be. And there's lots to discuss there. And by the way, it's not just about speeds, it's about other types of quality, packet loss, jitter, latency. These are all important things. If we just look at speeds, we're only looking at part of the issue. In some places, even the Commission itself, for example, has recognized that the bigger problem may actually be transport and not access. For example, when you're talking a territory like Northwest Hells or Northern Quebec. So the CRTC is really well placed to collect the data, to do the analysis, but I fear that it can't solve the problem completely for Canadians. It's just not possible. So what we really need is committed, stable, long-term funding from governments to do this, with the Commission certainly being able to fill in other gaps and so on, but I view that as more of a secondary part to the solution. So that concerns me, because at the end of the day, if we're not careful how we solve very real problems for real users, we could end up actually creating other unintended consequences that actually undermine the economy and in the process our international competitiveness, which I think we really need to be a lot more concerned about than we are as a country. So that's issue one. Issue two, very quickly, is what's the role of regulation versus competition? Well, in my mind, it's a pretty simple thing. The Commission's by and large been trying to go in this direction as well, and by Commission I mean the CRTC. And that is, the Commission has kind of viewed its role in the last few decades as regulating for the purpose of enabling competition. And I think that is a very good model. In other words, its purpose is to correct market failures. And recently we had a couple of big proceedings, one on the wireline and one on the wireless side, in which the Commission conducted reviews and found that wholesale remedies were required in both cases. Some major adjustments were required to the way that certain wholesale services are delivered on the wireline side, and basically focusing a lot more on the access piece, which is where the real constraint in non-duplicable facilities actually exists, and trying to reduce its involvement in regulating transport over time, and it will take time, because that's been very controversial in terms of how costing and pricing of that is done. And so if it can create market incentives to create more transport alternatives, that may take care of part of the problem. I think what we're going to have to watch carefully is how that transition occurs, because it is a transition, and to make sure that, again, unintended consequences don't follow. On the wireless side, the Commission found that wholesale remedies were required in the form of regulated wholesale roaming rates for the first time in decades. The Commission found that it wasn't a good idea to keep its hands off regulating wholesale roaming rates, to the disappointment of some of our constituents and clients. It did not agree that other types of wholesale services, which would enable other networks to interconnect with those who had spectrum and be able to use them on their own networks, was mandated. That was not the case, even though the conclusions were very similar in terms of both types of wholesale markets really requiring relief, but they found for certain reasons that we believe weren't fully supported by evidence that the second type of remedy shouldn't be granted. Anyway, there's appeals going on and stuff. I don't want to bore you with all those details. The other important role that the Commission has, and it's quite important, is in addition to correcting market failures, is to protect the interests of users where there is nobody that would be willing to bear a cost of doing something that is socially good. It's the old economics externalities problem, trying to internalize those costs somewhere so that things get done. So for example, the provision of 911 services, message relay services, and so on. And the Commission's been doing, I think, a very good job there, as I think generally it has been on the wholesale services side. You know, we may grumble about some things and take issue with a few things, but generally we're going in the right direction. So I think as long as our regulators continue focusing on targeting regulation for one of those two purposes, namely to make sure that retail markets are competitive and bottlenecks to that competition are removed, especially those that are inherent in the dominance and control of networks that the incumbent carriers have, then I think we'll be in a good place. Similarly, I think the Commission's continued focus on protecting the interests of users with regards to the provision of the types of network capabilities and services that the marketplace would never provide, such as 911 services and so on, in the absence of regulation, are worthwhile. And if the Commission continues to do that, it will be fulfilling its role very well. But I think we need to remember that we always need to look back and ask, why is regulation occurring, and make sure that it's targeted in the right place and for the right reasons. So I'll stop there for now.
The focus of my remarks is on 3 questions, and here they are. What's the internet for? Who's the internet for? And who is the internet debate for? But before I get into these questions, I did want to just add privacy and the Internet of Things and the consequences of this once brands start getting involved in it, which was an issue flagged by Mr. Denton. That's already a real issue. There's an example, and there's an application before the CRTC dating back to January 2014, challenging Bell Mobility's relevant advertising program, which has since been withdrawn. But I encourage you to take a look at that application. The alleged facts in terms of what Bell was doing in terms of its profiling of people based on their usage of internet services, based potentially on their location, demographics, and so on, and then sorting them into categories and then serving them up targeted advertisements based on that. Second point on this issue of brands getting involved in sucking up all this information about you and knowing your very intimate habits. I'd refer you to a report PIAC just released called Off the Grid, Location-Based Technologies in the Law. This looks at location and its role in marketing and how it's being collected, used, and disclosed in many cases by third parties, app providers, for example, to come up with a very intimate marketing profile of you based on the way you move through the world. And it's very interesting to find out that the way we move through the world may seem somewhat random, but it's highly personal in nature. So my prepared remarks, like I said, I'm going to address these 3 questions. And like I said, I'm focusing on the question of these 3 questions. I represent a large coalition of interest groups, including PIAC, Public Interest Advocacy Centre, a low-income Canadians group called Acorn Canada, 2 seniors groups, and the Consumers Association of Canada. They're known as the Affordable Access Coalition for the purposes of the CRTC's review of whether or not broadband internet access should be considered a basic telecommunications service. As part of this proceeding, Acorn Canada had its members write into the CRTC to let their views be known. And I wanted to share, through the course of this presentation, I'll share some of those views with you because I find them very compelling. And if there's one slide that you'll remember from my presentation today, it's this one. Someone wrote in response to the question, why is online access important to you? Connection. This is what we all use the internet for. It may be very obvious to you, but when we get into what that means to individuals in the following slides, you'll see. This is hugely important and something needs to be done about it. So what is the internet for? Connection. What do people do online? This person's writing in work, Hotmail, Google, Craigslist, YouTube for studying purposes. And that's an important point. This isn't just about triviality. Another question, why is online access important to you? And this is another intervener. It keeps me in tune with what's happening in the world. It keeps me in touch with family all over Canada. I use it for looking up things on the internet. It is a very important part of my life. It would be very hard not to be able to go without it. Sounds a lot like other utilities and essential goods we rely on. Again, what's the internet for? And why is online access important to everybody? Another compelling example of a low-income Canadian who took the time to write into the CRTC. As a single mother to a young child, it can be very difficult to be bringing my daughter to government offices to receive internet access, to search for work, or when I'm in school, and to be able to research information and study online. And if you have young children, you'll be able to relate to what this individual goes on to write. It is impossible to do so when she's present. Online access at home while my child sleeps would benefit me very much, and obviously not just for trivial things like entertainment. Research for school, applying for jobs, these are important functions of internet access. So let me share with you the views of 4 internet service providers who are involved in this lengthy CRTC proceeding to determine whether or not broadband internet access should be basic. First one up. I'll highlight the parts that I find most interesting. The first one up says, although of interest from an entertainment perspective, high bandwidth applications and services are not necessary to participate in the digital economy. The next one. Only wireline voice is an essential service, and that access to digital economy broadband services is important, but not essential for Canadians. I believe that single mother who would beg to differ. Third of 4 service providers I'd like to quote. A number of popular internet activities are most accurately characterized as satisfying the recreational and entertainment wants of Canadians rather than representing a basic use of the internet. It goes on. And the 4th selected service provider. What Canadians expect they should be able to use the internet for would be much more expensive than what should be considered a basic service as a government-supported policy. I think we're going to see how the CRTC deals with or views these issues, and whether they want to embark upon determining the types of uses to which broadband connections should be put. But I note that there's a tone in some of these submissions that basically says, we know what you need and what you deserve, and that these submissions are awfully at odds with some of the high-speed service offerings that are being rolled out by some of these service providers. Again, on the question of who's the internet for, this society, the Internet Society Canada chapter, says that the internet is for everyone. But the question to you, and the question to the regulators is it for everyone? Legally, internationally, the United Nations is basically saying it's given rise to being a human right. It's at the same level of access to water. From a regulatory perspective, which is the lens through which the CRTC looks at these things, the internet is not for everyone if the standard for basic internet access to date remains what's in the service objective, which is dial-up internet access. And practically speaking, is the internet for everyone? No, and I'll encourage you to look at the Affordable Access Coalition's submissions to the CRTC to date, an embryonic survey that they filed, some of the data that the CRTC publishes in its monitoring reports in terms of who has access to what, things like how much they're paying for their access, whether or not it meets the needs of Canadians. So my answer is this. The internet is not currently for everyone. Not everyone can access this essential service at sufficient speeds. And there are numbers of people who don't have the access in the first place, or the sufficient speeds, or the sufficient reliability, to your point, Chris, or at an affordable level. On the subject of affordability, and in response to the question, who is the internet for, please take a look at this slide. Someone explaining the reason, their views on the affordability of internet service and whether or not they can afford it, and they're saying it's extremely high, I can barely afford it. Extremely high, I can't afford it, so I cancel my service from time to time. And it's so expensive that I cannot afford it. So they've done a multiple choice there. But the message is clear, and there are hundreds of these submissions. Internet service to many Canadians is unaffordable. Check this one out. When asked, how do you feel about the current pricing of high-speed internet? And recall, this is a low-income Canadian. It's extremely high, and I can't afford it, but because I need it, I take money out of my food budget. Can you imagine having to take money from your family's food budget so that you can afford internet access? And doesn't that tell you something about how people feel about how important that service is? One more. What else? What does this individual sacrifice from their family budget in order to access that essential service? Food, recreation, rent, medication. this is serious stuff that this is a serious issue if people are sacrificing access to medication so that they can go online. Clearly, there's a value in being able to go online at the speeds that Canadians need to do the things that the single mother, for example, cited. So 80% in the embryonic survey that the Affordable Access Coalition put into the field, 80% of Canadians say that broadband internet service at home is essential, with 37% saying it's absolutely essential. 84% of respondents believe that all Canadians should have access to broadband internet service at home, no matter where they live, compared to only 15% who don't. The majority of Canadians as well are willing to pay some form of surcharge on their monthly telecom bills in order to ensure access and affordability of telephone and broadband internet service. So this begs the question, what is the basic level of internet access? And this is what the CRTC is going to be exploring in this ongoing proceeding. Chris says it's not just about speed. Speed's an important factor, quality is important. But how do we come up with this question? How do we come up with the answer to the question? I'm not going to bore you with this because I don't have much time. There's a rule that the Affordable Access Coalition is suggesting that the Commission do in its pursuit of universal telecom services. It's called the 50-80 rule. It looks, and it's used in the European Commission, by the European Commission, and at least 2 countries so far. It basically says, listen, what technology are 50% of the population using, and what's the take rate or subscription rate, speed-wise, for 80% of that population? That defines your base level in terms of what all Canadians at the universal level should expect. On the subject of this ongoing hearing, I find it funny that we even have to debate whether or not broadband is essential, but for belt and braces, we've had to go out there and argue that this is essential. Broadband is essential. And I'll refer you back to some of the quotes from the service providers, and you can see we're in a debate right now about whether or not broadband is basic and essential. And then what types of applications can be used by this broadband access. Does it even matter, I would ask you, if many people use broadband for quote-unquote trivial matters? I would ask you, how is socializing through the internet any different from socializing on the telephone? And the reason I ask you that is because years ago, the Commission did make the determination that having affordable access to home telephone service was an important policy objective and something that should be pursued and would be funded in areas where it was very uneconomic to provide. So this coalition's recommendations, basically all Canadians should have access to high-quality broadband connection. Using our proposed test, it's probably in the speed range of 5 to 10 megabits per second. We expect it to go up to 25 by 2020, although that's something we recommend the CRTC check on an annual basis. To deal with the compelling and very real affordability issues, we've recommended implementing an affordability funding mechanism, which lets low-income Canadians have a monthly subsidy of either $11 or $22, depending on a baseline or more ambitious model. And also for the Canadians who are in areas that are unserved or underserved by that necessary level of quality functionality, what we've termed the broadband deployment funding mechanism. I'm not going to bore you with how it works, but I just wanted to, what you should get from this chart is that to fund the proposals that this coalition is proposing isn't a radical idea. It's in line with the level of industry contributions in the United States. It's something that's supported by a lot of Canadians as well. And so I'll leave that at that. The actual cost of these 2 proposals range from anywhere from $378 million a year to $710 million a year. And this is a capped amount. And the amount that would go to helping service providers roll out to high-cost areas would be issued on an auction basis. So it wouldn't, you would have to step up and see if there's a business case to be in a certain area with the subsidy provided. Okay, my last question is this: who should get to debate the issues? Alphabetical order: academics, activists, advocates, consultants, engineers, individuals, or lawyers. Don't take it personally that lawyers are last. I note that there's a growing discourse, and there's this narrative emerging that certain people aren't entitled to talk about some of these issues. A Washington Post called "Why Internet Government Should Be Left to the Engineers." And then the next one from the Register, net neutrality. how to spot an arts graduate in a tech debate. I take offense to that as a very proud liberal artist. But the answer to the question I would suggest to you is that everyone gets to debate these issues. The CRTC, to its credit, has very open processes. It's engaged in very significant outreach. Its Part 1 process allows interested people to bring forth any matter and allow interested persons to intervene. And of course, social media is engaging or enabling broader engagement. I think the issue that, in terms of all these debates about issues relating to the internet, really goes to an issue of relevance and weight. The CRTC is always looking for facts and evidence in which to hang its decisions. It's a question for them, as the trier of fact, to determine what relevance and what weight do we give the submissions that they receive. Thank you.
Well, thanks. My name is Michael Geist. I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa, and I wanted to start by thanking the Internet Society for the invitation, and frankly just to say how exciting it is to see an Internet Society in Canada that is active and engaged and putting on events like this. I'm also worthy of applause, and also to say that I'm really thankful that we see a panel on these issues, so that I have the opportunity to get the kind of perspectives that we started to hear, particularly what I thought was a really compelling presentation from Jeff. So I wanted to start by actually highlighting what I thought was a bit odd phrasing. This panel is called Internet Policies and Protecting the Interests of End Users. And I have to say that in the world that I occupy, whether that's in the academic world or the advocacy world, I haven't seen people who are engaged in these issues described as end users for at least 10 years. We are called subscribers sometimes consumers, sometimes creators, sometimes citizens, sometimes just users or internet users. Jeff would call them single moms or seniors, but we're rarely end users. Now, I wondered why that was. Now, it may just be a networking issue. Many of the people involved think of the network and think of the users at the end of the node, and so that's the language that's simply there to reflect that. And if that's the case, then so be it. My fear sometimes, though, when we use end users, is to harken back where things were about 10 years ago, when end users were one of the stakeholders that you needed to consult as part of the multi-stakeholder participation that you wanted to try to achieve. And so that so long as you heard from the end users alongside all those other groups, you've done your job. Now, I'd argue that the way in which we've made policy around internet issues, for the most part, not always, but for the most part in Canada over the last 10 years, is not to think of the public as internet users, as end users rather, but to borrow from the CRTC, to think of these constituencies as being at the very center of their communication system or at the very center of the internet system itself. They are not at the ends. They are at the very center of what we are talking about. Now, that's often been derided by some people who have looked at some of the policy outcomes that we have seen over the last 10 years as somehow being populist. Governments are chasing after the popular position on some of these issues and ignoring what some of the large business constituencies might say or what their paid economists might say, and instead chasing after potential votes. Now, I argue that isn't being populist at all. It's reflecting instead the reality of what internet policy means, to whether it's the single mom or someone living in poverty, to just about everybody, not just in this room, but frankly almost anybody that we would meet on the street. The internet is, I think, undisputedly a central part of our daily lives, and so policies that better reflect that put us in the center, are not just smart politics, but they are also smart policy. Now, I think that we've actually, if you take a look, Tim mentioned net neutrality and said that we've largely got that right. I think if we take a look at a lot of the issues over the last 10 years, Canada's done pretty well on this issue, in a sense following what some would negatively call a populist approach. We've done well, I think, on net neutrality with a policy that's been in place already for some time, and while there are still some things at the edges, so to speak, has done fairly well. On copyright, we've got things like Notice and Notice, which it too has some issues, but by and large is a system that tries to put users at their center by protecting their privacy, but providing rights holders with the rights to better educate the public about some of their rules. We have anti-spam legislation, harshly criticized by many, but one that puts the users at the center and says that an opt-in approach is a far better approach to one of opt-out, which many took advantage of for a very long time, to be able to market and send messages that were clearly unwanted. If we take a look at the number of people that have fled those messages once they've been given the opportunity to do so. We've rejected takedown systems that we see in many other places. We've, by and large, rejected blocking systems that we see in many other places. And even on privacy, despite the ease with which you can get very pessimistic very quickly, we have had rulings like the Spencer decision in the Supreme Court of Canada that leaves no question that there is a reasonable expectation of privacy and the personal information of users. And even on bills like Bill C-13, this was the so-called cyberbullying bill that was really a lawful access bill. If one looks at where policy was almost 10 years ago on lawful access and where it ended once the bill was passed, it was a dramatic shift, far more privacy-friendly, a removal of the mandatory surveillance capability type rules that were included in some of those early bills. So I think it's great that we have the Internet Society Canada here, and I hope that it sees a role to get engaged. In a sense, welcome to the fight, one that's actually gone fairly well for the last 10 years. Now, what do we have to look forward to, and what do I hope the Internet Society will see itself becoming engaged in? One in which, as I say, puts those users at the center of things. Let me quickly go through 5, because we're going fast. First, I would say it's Trans-Pacific Partnership. I don't want to talk so much about networks. I want to talk about these other issues that ultimately impact. One's the TPP. Next week, our International Trade Minister at FAST will go to Atlanta, and judging by what Prime Minister Harper had to say in that Globe and Mail debate, Canada will cave on just about any issue to give this current government the ability to have a wedge issue on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, forcing the other parties to take a position on that. Within the TPP will be copyright reforms that the country and even the government itself rejected only a couple of years ago because we're being forced to include it. There will be anti-data localization rules, the subject of the panel that we just had before. There will be other rules that will preclude any attempts to try to deal with networks that make it difficult for people to have data flow freely across borders, even when there are legitimate concerns. The TPP, which doesn't necessarily sound like the Internet Society's issue, if you look at the headlines around things like automotive parts or dairy, is very much an issue for this body. There's the issues around access. We've already heard about some of those issues as well. I write about it in the column that I write each week. My next column is going to focus on it, in a sense to argue about my abject disappointment to have had the longest election campaign anyone can remember, and to see this issue barely surface at all. All we've gotten was one attempt by the Conservatives to talk about how, yes, they have spent and continue to plan to spend some money on the Connecting Canadians initiative, an approach that we have seen in place for the better part of 10 to 15 years, and doesn't ultimately address both affordability concerns, what we just highlighted here, the challenge that many have even for basic equipment, much less ensuring that we have universal access, with a goal that, if you take a look at it, says 98% connectivity by 2019. How that is possibly good enough, I don't understand, and how the opposition parties have not seen that this is at the center of people's lives and must surely form a part of what any electoral platform is, for me, similarly mystifying. There is the need for better oversight. We talked about it in the last panel as well, and it too, I would argue, is an Internet Society issue. Not just in the context of oversight of our surveillance agencies, but ensuring that a privacy commissioner has an effective enough power to do their job, to ensure as well, as we heard from Chris Tacit, to ensure that the CRTC has not just the purview of looking at some of these issues, but actually has the wherewithal to do something about it. Fourth, we have to think about blocking. And the Quebec blocking issue has, of course, come up, but I would argue that it is not only going to be in the context of blocking. The MPAA, or the RIAA, one of the copyright lobby groups, put out a release just this week talking about how there have been now more than 500 court-ordered blocks in Europe alone. This is an issue that will come here too. The issue of arguing that somehow the reforms we have seen in Canada have been insufficient, we will be told, and the argument is there is a need to engage in far more widespread blocking, and quite frankly, if the Quebec-based block efforts around online gambling succeeds, the argument will be that this is entirely doable and indeed necessary to ensure that we meet our other objectives. If you can do it for gambling, you can do it for copyright, and of course if you can do it for copyright, start to think about all the other things you might be able to do for it as well. And finally, there is a broader issue around regulating the internet itself. That is sometimes talked about not in the context of internet regulation, but rather in the context of things like levies or Netflix taxes and the like. But make no mistake, at the end of the day, this is fundamentally about some groups envisioning the prospect of bringing offline or not internet-based regulation to an online environment. And that surely should be part of the Internet Society mandate as well. Thanks very much for your attention.
I'm thinking of Byron Holling's comment about the big dog that's in the corner. And I can't help but think on so many of these issues that the big dog that sits in the corner of the yard that we play in is the CRTC. And I don't mean to suggest, as Chris was implying, that we lay everything at the feet of the CRTC and say, fix it. But I do think that the CRTC, under its mandate, and for lack of any clear direction from the federal government, can play a huge role in doing a lot, even from the information gathering perspective, and in a certain way advocating for the end user.
Really, I'm pretty much in agreement with what's been said here. I think, in fact, perhaps the only slight disagreement might be between Jeff and I on where the funding should come from for affordable use of the internet. You say that maybe the industry can afford it. I think that industry subsidies should be a second resort, and that government funding should be the primary source. But other than that, really, not much disagreement with anything that's been said up here.
Yeah, I'm not going to go off on a different tangent. There's certainly a lot of great comments. I think when I reflected on it a little bit, there is perhaps a governance issue in that there are so many pieces to this puzzle that we don't have enough attention cross-departmentally on some of these, to evolve some of these important issues. You see Sweden with a commission that sets a goal for them, or various goals, and then they have they're tracking those goals and how they perform. There's the I forget which country it is, has a minister of digital. We saw Michelle Borge, the NDP, had appointed her as a critic for digital. I guess I see so many slices and so much coordination that needs to happen across the board that perhaps that's something to think about.
I was at the OECD earlier. There's a conference on what they're doing in Sweden. And they had all kinds of private-public partnerships to lay broadband fiber in rural municipalities, be owned by the rural municipality on a common carrier basis, so that those who were actually doing the carriage would not necessarily be private companies. It would be available to all kinds of service providers on a non-discriminatory basis. You mentioned that here, and it's like raving socialist. But what is taken to be completely normal ways of solving a broadband problem in one country is sort of outside the boundaries of polite discussion. So I do think that it would be helpful if we had a government that was concerned with this. I'm not expecting one from any of the three parties anytime soon. But it would be nice if there was a broader understanding of how the problems of connectivity and public access and, could be solved more creatively than we do have at the moment in this country.
Okay, thank you. I'm reminded of something. I had a friend once who said that if you look at households, they use one room less than 2% of the time, the bathroom. So the bathroom is clearly expendable. So if you go back to that discussion of what is essential access to the internet and what's trivial access to the internet, the metrics that you use there are just, in my mind, stupid. It's access or it's not access. So.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something further to Tim's statement about Sweden and their program, their rating socialist program of installing municipally owned broadband in different places. And I'd like to interject here that that particular kind of agenda is kind of rolling around in the raving socialist province of Wakeboard, Alberta. Yeah, they've got a number of really good projects going on in Alberta, and the poster child of them all is the one from Olds, Alberta, which they spent 10 years convincing people that this was a good idea economically for them, and it is now up and running, and there are a number of others meeting constantly. It's being supported by the provincial government, not being talked about at the national level, which is a really big shame because in the States it is being talked about, and President Obama actually came out and spoke about it. So, you know, they're aware of this. We're not on the national level. We need to start a conversation on that.
Stephanie?
Thanks. Stephanie Barron. I apologize for not having been here earlier. I was busy volunteering for ICANN over an internet connection. I just want to make a couple of points. I live maybe 45 minutes on a fast day outside Ottawa, and my communications costs, very basic. I never watch TV. I only have it for people who mind my dog while I'm away at ICANN meetings. It's $265. And that's really too much. And I think city people forget that my internet is a point-to-point on the roof. When I'm broke, I can't cut it off and then start it again because I would have to pay for new installation. They have long memories. And it's the same thing with television. I don't have a nice handy cable coming in. It's a box on the roof because nothing works anymore. Now we're digital. So it's a confluence of a number of factors that are really, really disproportionately impacting rural residents. And at the same time, as a former bureaucrat, I have to be careful how critical I am here, the government is rushing to do everything electronically, which means an internet connection. All of the annual reports to Parliament, which I would suggest are a basic democratic right of every citizen, are now only available electronically. They've quit printing them. That's wrong. Meantime, we've got cutbacks to libraries. So not only does it cost me $65 to join the library that has the biggest internet connection, but there's a long queue onto that very limited opening hours for the library to get on the internet. This is, if we want to serve seniors in their homes, if we want to get people jobs, we've got to fix this like it was a public utility. Thank you.
Pass it on.
Thank you. I'm sorry, there's this Alan over again. I wonder if I could ask a question to Lynn Hamilton. Is that would that be in order, Mr. Chair?
Yes, she's always open for
She
questions.
likes street publicity. Come on.
Well, no. So what I wanted to ask is, I was very taken with your comments earlier in the morning about how does one get an issue onto the radar of a minister or a government. And at the same time, I was really taken with Jeff's technique of saying, this is me talking, the advocate, the lawyer, here's what the actual people on the street are saying. So how do we blend those two, Lynn? How do we take advantage of those powerful messages that Jeff has already and let them speak to the politicians so that this issue can get much more attention?
I was going to say, this is my but I would say this. There's always strength in numbers. So the more voices that you get together, the better stories. There are a bunch of simple tactics that we use. Sometimes it's polling to get an idea of where Canadians are on a radar screen. Sometimes it's thought papers, white papers.
put forward by think tanks and others. I mean, there's a range of things that I think we're going to look at as a society to get the issues that we care about on the radar screen. But ultimately, it is about knowing your audience and what's going to work. Because there's a million things we can do, right? We've got to prioritize and say, given the new government that's going to come in, what are they passionate about? How do we align ourselves with their agenda to say, what you care about, we care about. It's the same thing. And then once we can, it's a lot easier to sell them to do things on things that they already care about and make it look like their agenda is our agenda, than to kind of come at them in a very contrarian way and say, you may be going to do this over here, but what you're really be focusing on is something way over here. It's a lot harder. It can be done, but at the end of the day, you really want to find out, you want to know your audience for them, and then you want to embrace Canadians and say, you know what, this is what Canadians are thinking, demonstrate. There's a bit of thud factor to say, you know what, there are a lot of folks who feel the same way that we do. There are places that you care about, so let's put a campaign together that's thoughtful and meaningful, and we harness the voices of the people who are not only as members, and please feel free to join, put me in your surveys and tell you that you want to join. And add your voices to that debate. And I think you can always get on the agenda. It's just how do you target your message to the people who are going to listen and make it sound like something they want to do. And then, the most important part, don't forget, when they actually do it, you have to say thank you.
Yes.
Let's take one more question.
I'd like to talk about dogs. The CRTC's got this big consultation, as Mr. Tacit pointed out. They may be able to do all these great recommendations, but they don't actually have the power. So it's a dog with a lot of bark and no bite. On the other hand, we have Industry Canada that has the bite, but we don't really hear so much from them. My question is this, I'd like your opinion, should the two be merged, or can they actually exist separately?
I don't think it's required. A merger is required, and I don't think I said the CRTC doesn't have the bite. I just hope it doesn't bite the wrong thing, because that would be harmful. I think that's the problem. As I see it, the remedies it can grant are from a limited pool of who it regulates, as opposed to the broader base of taxpayers, where the relative amount of the subsidy would be much smaller per taxpayer than it would be, as a percentage of revenues of a certain smaller pool of telecommunication service providers. That's my issue. I don't think you need to merge them. I think what you need to do is have a government that's willing to stand up and say, yes, we recognize we have primary responsibility for this area, and so we have to commit to long-term stable funding as a society. We want to fix this problem, just like we want to, contribute to highway infrastructure costs or other types of national and municipal and provincial infrastructure costs on some formula. We're going to do this because this is part of our national infrastructure, and it's part of our economic and social fabric. That's what we need, I think.
Thanks. Well, two things. First, the cynic would say they already have merged. If you take a look at the mandate letter that the minister gave the current chair, although I think that's just being cynical. I think they're functionally separate, and I think they should remain so. I actually wanted to try quickly to respond to Alan's question to Lynn, and I don't have anywhere near the experience or expertise that Lynn does. But when I was engaged in some of the copyright fight about 10 years ago, we talked a lot to a lot of MPs, certainly talked to ministers, but talked to a lot of local MPs as well about what you'd need to resonate. And I remember that it's always stuck with me. And we talked how much do you have to hear from someone on an issue before it escalates up to the point that it's got your attention? And the response that we heard on multiple occasions was two letters from people in the riding, not all the AstroTurf nonsense that are emails of people coming from outside the riding that don't ultimately vote for the candidate. But people in the riding, where they look at the postal code on the letter coming in, and if it's the right postal code, it gets opened and read, and if it's not, it goes in the blue bin. 2 letters was enough to suggest that if there are 2 people taking the time to write to me, there's a whole lot of other people out there that are interested and concerned. That sounds really easy, but it's still not. But nevertheless, it doesn't take huge numbers to get attention if they're the right people speaking.
I'm the Director and Officer of the Internet Society of Canada chapter. One thing that Tim said earlier on sort of got me thinking about, there's really no law for the internet, and we're really applying 1950s Railway Act type telecommunications laws. It's really not appropriate. Here's a question for the panel. Should we be considering creating the Magna Carta of the internet, the Charter of Rights, Responsibilities, and Obligations? Groups like Internet Society Canada chapter, other public advocacy groups, could we come together, form a Magna Carta that basically sets out what the ideal internet is, to measure policymakers' decisions against, like come up with something ideal? Is that a practical thing to do?
I'll just say, I'll comment while let somebody answer first. The Brazilians have tried something similar with their new legislation.
Going back to, can you hear me? Okay, going back to the dog analogy. Who's the dog's master? Is it the end user? Is it the government? Is it the incumbents? Jean-François Mézé suggested that this dog, the CRTC, has no teeth. I disagree. The limits to responding to your question, the limits of the CRTC's jurisdiction under the Telecom Act and the Broadcast Act are certainly being tested. But it's been said here a number of times that there is no government leadership on this file. So to the extent that these acts, and I'm saying perhaps they could be merged, and this has been, I know Tim feels very strongly that they shouldn't be merged. To the extent that there will be no legislative reform done, you have to work with the existing tools that you have, and you have to speak the language of the regulator. The regulator speaks the language of the Telecom Act. And there's nothing inherent about the Telecom Act, even though it was formerly the Railway Act, that doesn't let the CRTC apply old school types of regulatory principles, the most important being common carriage, to new principles and new challenges that the convergence and confluence of broadcasting and telecom have brought. So that's how I would respond. And if I may just add one more thing in response to the dialogue about Lynn, how do you get this message heard that something needs to happen? Because clearly there's angst that something needs to happen here and there needs to be leadership. You also have to remember, and the current chair of the CRTC has said, just because we're at arm's length with the government doesn't mean we don't touch. You have to hope, and you may wonder, what is the level of communication, what level of synthesis is there, and advocacy for the end user is there between the regulator and the government saying, listen, we just did a huge consultation on basic broadband services and people are foregoing medicine. Can you please do something about that? Can you please look at reforming the acts? Can you please rewrite section 46 that lets us order or build outs, etc. So those are my
comments. I'll be quick. Please don't do that. The internet, we don't need another John Perry Barlow independence of cyberspace, right? I mean, we don't need to send a message that somehow this is a separate place and here are the kinds of rules that we think are appropriate. In fact, it goes exactly opposite of what I was trying to make the case earlier. This is core, it is at the center. And so the policies we need are not somehow out here, this is the ideal internet. We're talking about coming up with an ideal education system that can leverage the internet. We're talking about ensuring the kind of effective communication that we saw, or the commercial opportunities. It's at the center of what we do, and somehow suggesting that it is this separate and apart world that has its own standards, I think, from my own view, really sends the wrong message.
So I don't think we need to focus so much on a separate piece of legislation. I think what would be useful, though, would be to make the boundaries between the Telecom and Broadcasting Act a little bit clearer in the internet era. I think that's true. And I think that periodic reviews of both pieces of legislation, whether or not they're merged, and I don't really have a strong feeling one way or the other, is required. I mean, we have legislative requirements to review the bank legislation every 5 years, our privacy legislation every 5 years. Why in God's name, when we're moving at lightning speed in telecom and broadcasting, do we not have a statutory obligation to review those pieces of legislation every 5 years? That's what I think we need to do. In terms of sort of things that may need to change in terms of objectives, both statutes have a list of objectives. And yeah, as times can change, some of those may need some tweaking, but I don't think we need radical reform. I think we need to pay attention to it and not let it be the last thing on the list for Parliament to do.
I just want to clarify, my question wasn't to create new law, but I was really thinking of a series of principles. So here's the guiding principles that the internet should, and they would be based on a lot of other things that were already established, but basically updated for the types of things that technologically weren't possible in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or 80s or even the 90s, but what's possible today, and basically a set of principles that would govern as a way to measure against any actual regulation and legal.
The reality is,
high-level principles.
yeah, the reality is that both statutes have objectives. Both statutes have objectives in them, and that's where those principles reside. My experience with applying those principles is because they're numerous, is that you can make whatever you want of them for the purpose of any one legal argument. That's the reality. It's just very hard to be driven by the objectives. It's nice to make sure that all the important ones are in there, but which ones will take precedence over every other one is going to really depend on the particular situation you're looking at any given point in time. They all can't be given equal weight all the time.
Okay, we'll hold that there. Tell me a quick comment, then the last comment question from there, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lynn to do a wrap-up. Thank you.
No, you just go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. We've talked a little bit about the no Netflix tax. We talked a lot about end users and money. There's no GST on what I pay for Netflix. There's no GST applied to what I get from Apple. My company buys some targeted Facebook ads. There's no GST on that. How long will this last, this no Netflix tax? How long will governments be able to resist? Like around the world, not just ours. I mean, this is something governments are thinking about everywhere, and they're going to have to tax digital things in order to maintain their revenues or boost their revenues in the face of not raising income taxes. This is the thing around the world. I'm just wondering what the panel thought about this, how long it's going to take, what's going to happen.
Very briefly, if we want to save the Canadian broadcasting industry, we need to rethink it root and branch. And so in other words, taxing for the sake of saving the broadcasting industry is probably a false. The more general issue of raising revenue on internet transactions is inevitable, and it's just going to be addressed.
Yeah, the unfortunate outcome or effect of this, of labeling a fee to support creating Canadian content a Netflix tax is that we inevitably get into this confusion of talking about what is a real tax from what was that levy system. The levy system for funding, let's say, creating Canadian content doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon, given where the parties stand. But applying a sales tax or goods and services tax on digital transactions is both inevitable, I would suspect. Within 5 years, we'll see it here, and I suspect we'll see it in most jurisdictions. We're seeing a lot of jurisdictions run to do it, and there isn't a particularly compelling argument that if I buy Netflix direct from Netflix, there's no HST, but if I buy it through Apple, which I can do, there is. It doesn't make any sense. And of course, if I buy Xiaomi or Crave or whatever, I also pay those taxes. It doesn't make any sense not to levy, and they will levy. The problem will be explaining why that Netflix tax is not the Netflix tax that we were talking about.
Thank you, Michael.
So, I want to thank you all for joining us today. The Canadian chapter of the Internet Society, as you know, is a fledgling group of concerned citizens who care passionately about the future of the Internet. As I've said before, we join 60,000 like-minded individuals around the globe. Now, while each chapter will differ on country priorities and maybe at different levels in their use of the internet, we share a common goal of working to ensure an internet that is safe, open, and secure. And as we all know from our discussions today, this is no small task. So one of our global mandates is to provide education through symposiums like we had today, and I'm proud to say we had a number of impressive speakers who shared their views. I want to personally thank all of our panel members and speakers for agreeing to participate today. Your comments were thoughtful, and your presence here helps us form the ideas and initiatives that will move this organization forward. I would encourage everyone here today to consider joining our society. We seek to educate, inform, and advocate for Canadians, especially the folks who govern them, about the risks of a less than open internet and how we can ensure it remains, like Canada, strong, open, and free.